When you watch forest rangers start a controlled burn, to an outsider, like someone who doesn't understand the science, it looks incredibly counterintuitive.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it looks like complete
Right.
madness.
They're literally taking drip torches and, setting fire to the exact ecosystem they're supposedly hired to protect. It just looks like sheer mindless destruction.
It looks that way until you actually look at the mechanics of what they're doing,
Yeah.
because that fire is bound by these microscopic parameters. I mean, it requires specific humidity levels, exact wind direction.
Highly trained crews, right?
Exactly. A highly trained crew calculating the topography,
hmm
and it has a singular life-saving goal.
Which is to clear out the dead, highly combustible underbrush, right?
Right.
So that the whole forest doesn't go up in a catastrophic, uncontrollable megafire a few months later.
Right. Context changes the entire definition of the action.
It really does.
Yeah.
The line between destruction and preservation in that scenario is,
Right.
it's entirely about the strict rules governing the action.
Yeah, without the rules, without that perimeter, it's just a wildfire.
Exactly. And that tension between an action that looks aggressive on the surface,
Mhm.
but is governed by this intensely specific, micromanaged set of rules underneath, that is exactly where we're heading today.
It's a heavy one today.
It is. Welcome to another deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us. Today, we are analyzing theological texts and historical legal commentaries that deal with, frankly, an incredibly complex and heavily debated territory.
Very heavily debated.
Yeah. We're looking at how classical Islamic scholars interpreted specific religious texts regarding domestic conflict and a concept known in Arabic as nushuz.
Specifically, we're examining the Islamic legal perspective on a very specific, highly scrutinized verse in the Quran, Surah An-Nisa, verse 34,
Right.
which addresses the concept of a husband striking a wife in cases of extreme marital rebellion. And our sources today compile the theological interpretations of massive historical figures.
And then they take a huge pivot, right?
Yeah, they pivot into a really broad comparative analysis of global domestic violence statistics.
So let's set the ground rules for you, our listener, right out of the gate here. Because we are analyzing texts that make aggressive claims.
Very aggressive.
The authors of our source material actively weaponize modern statistics to compare historical Islamic law with modern Western societies. So I want to be clear, we aren't here to litigate if their broader worldview is right or wrong.
Right, our job isn't to take sides or endorse these views.
Exactly. We aren't here to endorse or condemn their theology. We're here to dissect the mechanics of their arguments, to act as your guides.
We want to show you exactly what the original source material argues.
Yeah, to reconstruct how these historical scholars framed their worldview, how they built their legal arguments, and, the specific logic they applied to their societies.
And the overarching theme you're going to notice in these texts is that the historical scholars acted less like abstract philosophers and more like...
Like legal technicians.
Exactly, like legal technicians. They were hyper-focused on defining the absolute boundaries of the text.
Because they refused to read a single word in isolation.
Right. Instead, they apply a multi-step legal and psychological framework that drastically narrows how the text can even be applied.
So the text insists that you cannot even begin to analyze the physical act mentioned in the verse without mapping out the strict chronological sequence that precedes it.
The sequence is everything here.
It is. The verse lays out 3 distinct mandatory steps for a husband dealing with a wife's nushuz. And we should probably define nushuz before we go any further.
Yeah, that's crucial because the sources don't describe it as like a mere disagreement or just a bad mood.
Right, it's not just bickering.
No, it translates roughly to rebellion or severe disobedience or an active existential undermining of the marriage contract itself.
So it's an act of hostility.
Exactly. So when faced with this, the text outlines a sequence. Step 1 is exhortation and advice.
Okay.
Step 2 is abandoning them in the marital bed.
And then step 3.
Step 3 is the strike. Now, our sources rely heavily on the commentary of Abu Abdullah al-Qutubi.
And for context for you listening,
Hello.
al-Qurtubi was a massive figure in 13th century Islamic scholarship. He was an Andalusian jurist who settled in Egypt, and his work is famous for its heavy focus on extracting precise legal rulings.
Right, and al-Qurtubi explicitly states that this sequence is not a menu of options.
You can't just pick and choose.
Exactly. A husband cannot jump to step 2 or 3. He is legally mandated to begin with verbal counsel.
He has to appeal to her intellect, her faith, and their shared history.
Yes.
Which, that requires time and emotional labor. A husband can't just fulfill the requirement of exhortation by, yelling a command over his shoulder.
No, it implies a sustained dialogue.
Right. And if that fails, he moves to the second step, which is separation in the bed, which is fascinating from a spatial and psychological perspective.
It really is. It's a physical withdrawal of intimacy and presence, creating a silent boundary within the home.
And the mechanics of that second step are highly intentional.
Mhm.
Because in the context of a medieval home,
Which often lack the sprawling privacy of modern houses.
exactly. So turning one's back in the marital bed or sleeping in a different corner of the room, that is a profound, palpable disruption of normalcy.
It's an emotional boycott. And Al-Qurtubi is absolute on this point.
Yeah.
Only if these first two psychological and emotional steps completely fail to bring about a resolution is the third step even theoretically permitted on the table.
Reading through the scholars' insistence on this sequence, it feels like they engineered a mandatory de-escalation ladder.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Because they're forcing the husband to exhaust verbal and passive restrictive options, which naturally forces a cooling-off period.
Right. It drains the emotional volatility and blind rage out of the situation.
A man can't claim a crime of passion if he is legally required to spend weeks talking and sleeping apart first.
Exactly. And the source material highlights this by asking a rhetorical question. Why doesn't the text instruct the husband to just take the issue straight to the local judge, the kotu, at the first sign of rebellion?
Right. Why not just go to court?
Well, because dragging a marital dispute into the public sphere of a courtroom instantly destroys the privacy of the family unit.
That makes sense.
So the scholars argue that the Quran mandates internal household resolution first to protect the family's dignity. This sequence is designed to contain the conflict, utilizing escalating internal psychological pressure rather than public exposure.
Okay, so let's follow the timeline. Step 1, the dialogue fails. Step 2, the physical separation fails. The nushuz is entrenched.
It's entrenched.
The text then permits the third step, a strike. And this is the crux of the entire historical debate.
Yeah.
Because the cognitive dissonance here for a modern English speaker is massive.
Oh, absolutely.
When we hear the word strike or hit in a domestic context, we picture a closed fist, bruising, trauma, a hospital visit.
But the historical definition of the Arabic word used in the text, daraba, sharply diverges from our modern English assumptions of battery.
Yeah, the sources spend an enormous amount of ink defining the exact nature of this action.
They do. The primary unyielding legal condition laid out by classical scholars is that the strike must be ke mubari.
Right, and the text translates ke mubari as non-severe or non-injurious.
Yes.
But what surprised me in the source material is that they didn't leave non-injurious up for subjective interpretation. They legally codified the mechanics of what that means to remove any ambiguity.
They really did. Al-Qurtubi draws directly on the hadith of the farewell pilgrimage.
Which was a major sermon the Prophet Muhammad gave to tens of thousands of followers near the end of his life, right?
Exactly. And in that sermon, this action was explicitly paired with a massive list of prohibitions.
Like what?
Well, it cannot break a bone, it cannot leave a mark or a scar, it cannot draw blood.
Wow.
It is strictly forbidden to strike the face or any sensitive areas. And add to that, it cannot be coupled with verbal insults or humiliation.
I mean, the list of prohibitions is so extensive, it practically redefines the action itself.
It does.
No bruises, no broken skin, no red marks, and no verbal abuse. But the sources provide a historical exchange that takes this from a list of rules to a vivid physical visual.
Yes, the exchange with Ibn Abbas.
Right. A prominent early scholar named Atta asked Ibn Abbas to define Gay Mubari.
And understanding who Ibn Abbas was is critical here for you listening.
Yeah, give us the context.
He was a direct companion and cousin of the Prophet, often referred to as the ocean of knowledge in classical tradition.
So his word carried weight.
Massive weight. When he spoke on the interpretation of a Quranic verse, it was considered highly authoritative. So when asked what a non-severe strike looks like in practice, Ibn Abbas replied, with a siwak or something similar.
A sikwak, which is a dental twig.
Right.
It's a small piece of root from the arak tree, roughly the size and weight of a pencil or a standard toothbrush. So the highest historical authority on Quranic exegesis is capping the maximum physical tool you can use at the equivalent of a toothbrush.
That's the visual.
The mechanics of that are fascinating. It physically prevents actual injury by design. You could not put someone in the hospital with a toothbrush if you tried.
No, the intent is fundamentally decoupled from physical pain.
Right.
Furthermore, Al-Qurtubi adds a binding legal mechanism to this, which is the concept of daman, or liability.
Oh, okay.
If the husband violates any of these strict parameters, if he leaves a bruise, causes an injury, or, God forbid, causes death, he is held fully legally liable as the guarantor of her safety.
So he faces retaliatory punishment or financial compensation mandated by the court.
Exactly. The legal system immediately turns on him.
So the mistranslation of the word strike into English without this massive legal footnote completely alters the perception of the text.
It changes everything.
Because the scholars are defining an act that is symbolic. It's a physical manifestation of a psychological boundary being drawn.
Right.
It's a punctuation mark at the end of a long, exhausted sequence, not an attempt to physically subjugate.
The source explicitly describes it as a psychological shock to the system. It is designed to disrupt a toxic, entrenched pattern of behavior, not to inflict suffering.
But having established how a restricted sequential process, culminating in a symbolic gesture with a twig, the sources move to heavily restrict the who.
Yes, this is a crucial point. They are fiercely defensive against the idea that this is a general manual for how men should treat women.
They insist this framework is reserved for a highly specific, rare personality type.
Right. They describe a woman who is sharp-tongued, continually rebellious, actively seeking to humiliate her husband, and completely unresponsive to the intellectual appeal of step 1 and the emotional boycott of step 2.
So a very extreme case.
Extremely rare. The text implies that a woman from a healthy background or standard disposition would never let a dispute escalate to this point.
She would either resolve it through dialogue, or if the marriage was genuinely irreconcilable, she would just seek a divorce, right? A khula, through the courts.
Exactly. The nushuz described here is an irrational, stubborn entrenchment designed to break the marriage from the inside.
There's also a massive prerequisite attached to the husband before he can even claim nushuz.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I kept thinking of modern contract law while reading this. In contract law, you cannot sue someone for a breach of contract if you are actively in breach yourself.
You must have clean hands.
Exactly. You have to have clean hands.
That is a perfect analogy for the Islamic legal mechanism here. This entire 3-step sequence is contingent on the husband flawlessly fulfilling all of his marital duties.
So he must be providing for her financially, treating her fairly, fulfilling her rights.
Right. If he is abusive, neglecting his duties, or acting oppressively, he cannot claim she's in rebellion.
Because she is the one in rebellion.
Exactly. He has zero legal standing to utilize this framework.
Okay, this brings us to the philosophical why underpinning this system. The source quotes Sheikh al-Sharawi, a prominent 20th century scholar, who uses an analogy to explain the underlying logic of the symbolic strike.
The father and son analogy.
Yeah, he compares it to a father disciplining a son. He argues that a father doesn't hate his son. He uses light discipline to prevent the son from continuing down a path that will result in massive destructive pain later on.
Right. The action is rooted in protection, not malice.
Al-Sharawi is arguing that the husband's intervention is an act of preserving the family structure, stepping in to stop a behavior that will ultimately destroy their shared life.
Yes.
But I have to push back heavily on the source here because this is where the cultural friction is the most intense for you listening today.
It definitely is.
Because to a modern ear, comparing a wife to a misbehaving child is inherently infantilizing.
Absolutely.
We view marriage as an egalitarian partnership, a contract between absolute equals. So framing it as a parent-child dynamic sounds incredibly paternalistic.
Right.
How do the historical texts reconcile this deeply paternalistic tone with the idea that a marriage is supposed to be a partnership of mutual respect?
Well, you're identifying the core paradigm shift between medieval jurisprudence and modern Western egalitarianism.
Okay.
The historical scholars did not view marriage through the lens of modern absolute egalitarianism. They viewed it through a framework of defined complementary roles.
So different but complementary.
Exactly. The Quran designates the husband as the qawwam, the maintainer, provider, and ultimate protector of the household.
Okay.
So from their historical paradigm, that paternalistic tone isn't a flaw in the system. It's the structural reality they believed was divinely ordained.
I see.
The husband bears the ultimate responsibility for the survival of the family unit, so he is granted this hyper-restricted authority to manage its existential threats.
But even granting their historical paradigm, what is the actual desired outcome here? I mean, a symbolic tap with a twig doesn't magically make someone stop being angry.
No, it doesn't. But the source argues that for this specific rare subset of women, The physical boundary, or even just the knowledge that the husband possesses the legal authority to draw that boundary, resolves a psychological impasse.
It's the shock to the system they mentioned.
Right. The text heavily stresses that the goal is never subjugation or fear. The entire machinery of this law is aimed at one singular outcome: restoring Mawadda and Rahma.
Which translates to affection and mercy.
Yes, affection and mercy. The Quran states explicitly that the foundational pillars of marriage are affection and mercy.
And Nushuz is the cancer that destroys those pillars.
Exactly. So the three-step process is a desperate, heavily regulated attempt to break the cycle of rebellion and reset the relationship back to a state of affection before the marriage collapses entirely.
It is a system built on the very pragmatic assumption that human beings are deeply flawed,
Yeah.
that closed-door relationships can become incredibly toxic, and that sometimes highly rigid, almost theatrical interventions are required to snap people out of destructive loops.
It's very pragmatic.
But this is where the source material takes a sharp, aggressive pivot.
Yeah, it really does.
The author realizes that defending a toothbrush strike on purely historical or theological grounds won't convince a modern critic. So they transition from defense to offense.
They build a sprawling, comparative argument weaponizing global statistics against Western societies.
Which is quite the leap. So let's look at that. The author pulls data from figures like Dr. Mohammed Said Ramadan al-Bouti and Western professionals like Richard F. Jones from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists.
And the thesis they're constructing is really stark. They argue that Western societies, having rejected codified, micromanaged release valves for human conflict, have not eliminated domestic violence.
No.
Instead, they argue, Western societies have unleashed it in its most catastrophic, unmitigated forms.
And the statistics they cite are harrowing. Just looking at the United States, they quote Richard F. Jones's 1993 article stating a woman is battered every 12 seconds.
Every 12 seconds.
Yeah. They cite the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, claiming 17% of women arriving in emergency rooms are victims of partner violence.
Wow.
And that domestic violence causes more injuries to women than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined.
And one of the most potent images the source uses regarding the U.S. is the architecture of domestic violence shelters.
Oh, this part was striking.
Right. They point out that these shelters must be hidden away, camouflaged behind decorative walls and normal-looking facades.
To protect fleeing women from violent partners actively hunting them.
Exactly. The author uses this to argue that a society requiring hidden fortresses for its women has completely lost control of male aggression.
And the text sweeps across Europe with the same lens. They cite German studies showing over 100,000 women facing severe violence yearly.
Which they link to systemic issues like long-term unemployment and alcohol abuse.
Right. And in France, they quote police reports stating 2 million women are subjected to beatings.
2 million.
With 92.7% of those assaults occurring in urban centers.
They even quote a French official making this grim observation. If a man beats a dog in the street, someone calls the Animal Welfare Society, but if he beats his wife, society looks the other way.
It's a brutal comparison. And in the UK, they reference a poll of 7,000 women, where 28% reported being attacked.
And the source makes a point to emphasize the nature of these injuries. We are no longer talking about a symbolic twig here.
No, not at all. The UK reports cite broken ribs, deafness from ruptured eardrums, burns, and stab wounds.
And the argument expands globally to show this isn't just an isolated cultural issue.
Yeah, they cite a case in China where a doctor was severely beaten simply for refusing a divorce.
And another where a man broke his wife's arm and forced her to sleep in a duck pen.
In Canada, they point to 150,000 men beating their wives.
They even target the highest echelons of power in Japan.
Oh, the Prime Minister?
Yes, they claim former Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka wrote in his autobiography that beating a woman was the best way to handle her.
And advised his own son-in-law to beat his new bride.
Exactly. So the author uses all of this data to build toward one specific legal case from Italy that serves as the philosophical anchor of their critique.
The Compardo case.
Yes, the Compardo case. In Sicily, a 42-year-old construction worker named Francesco Compardo severely beat his wife, Anna, in a fit of jealousy because she was leaving the house frequently.
And he was initially given an 8-month prison sentence.
He was, but the appellate ruling is what the source focuses on.
Right, because an Italian judge overturned the jail sentence.
Overturned it entirely. The judge's official reasoning was that marital relations are inherently complex and that a sudden passing outburst of violence provoked by jealousy shouldn't be heavily punished by the state.
The judge legally shrugged and said, essentially, This is just the messy reality of marriage.
And this ruling is the crux of the source's rhetorical strategy. They ask the reader to place the Italian judge next to the classical Islamic jurist.
Okay, let's look at that comparison.
The Western system, in this instance, excuses a severe, trauma-inducing, jealousy-fueled beating as normal marital complexity.
Right.
The Islamic system, conversely, forbids acting on sudden anger, requires weeks of de-escalation, forbids hitting the face, forbids leaving a mark, and legally limits the physical act to a sidewalk.
I mean, it's an incredibly aggressive whataboutism, but as a structural argument, it forces the reader to confront a blind spot.
It does.
The author is saying to the critic, you mock our ancient text for permitting a highly regulated symbolic action with a twig. Meanwhile, your civilized systems either look the other way, excuse broken ribs as complexity, or require secret bunkers to keep women alive.
Exactly. The author's thesis is that true adherence to the strict Islamic legal framework acts as a pressure valve.
Because the rules are so intensely micromanaged, it forces a man to process and control his anger, preventing the explosive, murderous rage seen in the global statistics.
The argument is that by acknowledging the potential for conflict and legislating its absolute maximum boundaries, the law prevents the escalation that occurs when societies pretend the potential for violence doesn't exist.
Which naturally forces us to confront the most glaring question of this entire analysis for you listening.
The equality question.
Yes. If we are discussing legal rules, pressure valves, and repairing the marriage, any modern listener is asking about the mechanics of equality.
Naturally.
If Nusha's rebellion is the cancer destroying the affection and mercy of a home, and if a symbolic strike is the ultimate psychological shock needed to cure it, why didn't the scholars interpret the rules to allow women to utilize the exact same tool?
Right. If he's destroying the marriage, why can't she use the siwak?
Exactly. If the husband is the one destroying the marriage, why doesn't she get to use the siwak?
Well, the source material anticipates this exact objection. They do not shy away from the asymmetry of the law.
Okay, what's their defense?
The scholars built their argument on what they perceived as fundamental, unalterable biological and psychological differences between the sexes.
Oh.
Their reasoning is entirely pragmatic and focused on the safety of the woman.
So the text argues that if a woman were to physically strike a rebellious husband, even a light symbolic tap designed to correct his behavior, it would not function as a psychological reset.
No, they argue it would trigger a catastrophic escalation.
Because of male pride.
The classical scholars contended that a man's pride and physiological makeup, when challenged physically by his wife, would not respond with introspection or sudden clarity.
Right.
It would trigger an uncontrollable, raw, masculine aggression. The man would likely unleash a savage, disproportionate counterattack that could severely injure or kill her.
The source frames it as a terrifying but realistic rhetorical question. Is a theoretical equality in action worth sacrificing the woman's physical safety?
Right.
If granting her the legal right to strike him means she inevitably ends up with broken bones, is that actual justice? The text concludes that it is not.
However, this asymmetry in the method does not mean the rebellious husband escapes accountability.
This is a huge point.
It's a massive misconception the source aims to correct. The Islamic legal framework absolutely punishes the rebellious husband.
It just removes the burden of executing that punishment from the wife to protect her from physical retaliation.
Exactly. The wife isn't expected to just sit there and endure a rebellious or abusive husband.
She delegates the enforcement.
Yes. The mechanism for this in historical Islamic law is the qadi,
The judge.
the judge. The qadi acts as the wife's proxy and her protector.
So if a husband is abusive, neglecting his financial duties, or displaying nushuz himself, the wife bypasses the internal household remedies and appeals directly to the judicial authority.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that, because it's important to understand how a medieval woman actually did this.
Yeah, how does that work in practice?
Well, she didn't need to fight him physically. She could approach the court, often with the backing of her wali, her male guardian, or family members, or she could directly present her case.
And the judge operates with the full monopoly on violence provided by the state.
Precisely. The judge has access to tazir.
Which is discretionary punishment.
Right, discretionary punishment. While the husband is limited to a toothbrush within the home, the judge is bound by no such limitation when punishing the man. If the court finds the husband guilty of rebellion or abuse, the judge can order severe physical punishment, such as public flogging, or sentence him to imprisonment.
So the state enforces the behavior in a way the wife safely cannot.
Exactly.
I mean, it completely shifts how we view the structural equality of the system.
It really does.
There is exact symmetry in accountability. Both a rebellious wife and a rebellious husband face severe consequences.
But the asymmetry lies purely in the execution.
Right. The husband is trusted with a micromanaged, non-injurious tool for a specific type of female rebellion. And the wife utilizes the limitless power of the state court to crush male rebellion.
The source argues this is a masterpiece of legal engineering. Yeah, the system accounts for biological reality by deliberately designing different methods of enforcement to ensure the physically weaker party is protected by the state while still holding the stronger party accountable.
It's an intricate web of checks and balances. The husband has authority, but the moment he abuses it, he is stripped of that authority and subjected to state-sanctioned violence.
It is a dense, highly pragmatic approach to human nature.
It is. And that brings us full circle to how we understand these historical texts. They aren't just arbitrary lists of ancient rules. They are heavily engineered systems trying to manage the darkest, most volatile aspects of human interaction as they understood it.
We've covered immense ground today.
We really have. We saw how scholars like Al-Qurtubi and Ibn Abbas interpreted verse 34 not as a blank check for abuse, but as a heavily restricted, symbolic last resort measure culminating in a small twig.
We examined the strict psychological prerequisites, requiring the husband to have flawless conduct himself.
And we analyzed how the authors weaponized global statistics to argue that Western systems fail to contain male aggression.
And finally, we explored how the courts acted as the state executioner on behalf of women to maintain accountability without risking their safety.
If we step back from the specific theology for a moment, this deep dive reveals a fascinating universal tension.
Yeah.
The source material attempts to solve the unpredictability of human conflict through strict, micromanaged legal codes. But it forces you to ask a lingering question.
Can a legal framework, no matter how perfectly structured on paper, no matter how brilliantly historically debated, ever fully account for the sheer unpredictability of human emotion when the doors are closed?
It goes right back to the controlled burn. You can draw the perimeter, you can check the wind, you can legislate the exact size of the flame.
But at the end of the day, you are still playing with fire.
You really are. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As always, keep questioning, keep exploring the sources, and we will see you next time.